Hello everyone, this is FIDE Master Dalton Perrine from chessuniversity.com, and today we're going to be continuing our free video series on understanding the imbalances in chess. In the previous video of this series, we learned about the initiative imbalance, how we can use the initiative effectively in our own games, and this video instead is going to focus specifically on the next imbalance, which is the material imbalance. Now, understanding the material imbalance is fairly straightforward. All you have to do for the most part is add up the point count of the pieces that are on the board and compare them with one another. White's point count versus black's point count. Many positions will be even in material and with an even point count, and thus this imbalance will not be present at all. But in other positions, we will either have a lead in material ourselves, while other different positions we will have less material than our opponent. The important thing to understand, though, is that no matter which way the imbalance swings, whether it's in our favor or in our opponent's favor, we need to take into account this in positions where it's present. We need to know if we have a material lead or our opponent has the material lead. These kind of situations can have different types of plans for the most part. So in order to understand the material imbalance in chess better, we first need to have a brief understanding of what the point values of each of the pieces are in chess. Once we understand each piece's point value, then we'll be better prepared to know if we're ahead or behind in material. So let's evaluate each piece and see what its point value is. So the commonly accepted point value of each piece goes like this. A pawn is worth 1 point. The bishops and the knights are both worth 3 points each, and these are also known as the minor pieces, of course. The rook is worth 5 points. The queen is worth 9 points. And the king is worth an infinite value. It doesn't really have a value because you can't capture or trade your king during a game. So the point value helps us to understand when we're ahead or behind in material. Instead of just counting how many pieces are on the board, how many individual pieces, we want to be able to add up the total point value for both sides. Just because there might be 5 pieces on the board for white and 5 pieces on the board for black doesn't mean that the point count would actually be equal. White might have pieces with a higher point value compared to black, or black might have the higher point value with his combined pieces compared to white. So let's start off with a basic position where we're going to count up who has more points on the board, and we're going to figure out what the material imbalance is in this situation. So in this position here, we want to count it up here, and let's kind of do a count for the most part. So pawns are worth 1 point, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pawns, so 7 points. So we keep the 7 in mind. Oops. Next is the bishops and the knights, which are worth 3 points each. So 10, 13, 16, 19. Then the rooks are worth 5 each. So 24, 29. And then the queen is worth 9 points. So that would end up being a total of 38 points for white in this position. Now let's count it up for black. So remember, 38 points for white here. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pawns, so 8 points. 11, 14, 17, and if you include the minor pieces here. 22, 27, once you add the rooks. And then adding in the queen is going to be 36. So in this position, black has 36 points on the board compared to white's 38. So white here has a material lead of 2 points, or you could, I guess, equate that to a material lead of 2 pawns in a way. Now, this is all despite the fact that actually there's the same amount of, the same number of pieces on both sides of the board. Black has 8 pawns, plus the 2 rooks, plus the queen, the king, and the 3 minor pieces. So black has 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. He has 15 pieces on the board if you include the 8 pawns. And white also has 15 pieces on the board as well. 7 pawns, and then 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So both sides have 15 pieces on the board. However, because the value of those pieces is different, white actually ends up having a 2-point advantage, or a 2-pawn lead in a way, if you 1 point for 1 pawn. So in this position, ultimately, white does have a material lead. Now the next question becomes, though, how should white use this advantage to help him get closer to winning the game? It's one thing to have an advantage, but you want to be able to use it to further your chances of winning the game at the end of the day. Well, a general rule you want to follow, and this is going to be important in almost any position where you have a material lead, is that when you do have a material lead, you want to trade off pieces of even point value. For example, if white could trade off one of his knights, let's imagine, I'll show in a second, but let's imagine white trades off let's say trades off these 2 knights and a bishop for black's 2 knights and a bishop. So let's kind of edit the position to do that. Okay, so this would be the situation at that point. Both knights are missing, as well as the bishop for each side. Let's imagine also the rooks come off the board. The rooks and the queens as well. So let's also trade those off evenly. So we reach this kind of position here. And we can see that even though it's the exact same material advantage, 2 points for white still in this position, white now has the only piece on the board, or the only minor piece, or main moving piece if you don't include the pawns. So in this kind of situation, eventually if white would be able to trade off his pieces evenly, trading off a pair of knights on both sides of the board, a pair of bishops, another pair of knights, trading off the rooks, trading off the queens, we could reach a position like this theoretically, where white essentially has the only piece, only main moving piece on the board. So ultimately, you can kind of think of this like a sports game in a way. If one team has 5 players on one side, one team has 5 players, the other team has 4 players, then there's definitely an advantage for the team with 5 players over the 4 players, but the 4 players on the other team can put up a fight. However, if one team has only 1 player on the team and the other team has 0 players, then the 1 player alone can kind of do whatever he wants, and he can continuously score easily since there's no defense at all. So in a way, if you have a material lead, you want to start trading pieces off evenly so that you can ultimately reach a position where there's less pieces on the opponent's side of the board, and it's easier for you to manifest and prove your material lead on your side of the board. So just because we have 1 extra piece early in the game doesn't necessarily mean that the game is going to automatically win itself. Our opponent will be able to put up some resistance with the remaining pieces that they have, but if you start trading off pieces, the less pieces on the board, the harder it is for the opponent to put up resistance at the end of the day. Now, another reason that trading off pieces is a good plan for the side who's ahead in material is because the more pieces there are on the board, then the more complicated the position can become, and the more likely it is that the side with the extra piece might make a mistake and lose the material that they were ahead. However, again, if you have the only piece remaining on the board, then your opponent will have a much more difficult time causing you any kind of trouble, and they won't have a easier time causing you problems that might lead to you making a mistake. So let's switch over to our next position, where we're going to have a lead in material, and we're going to figure out what we should do in that position. Okay, so in this position here, the first question ends up being, what is the material difference between white and black? You can maybe pause the video, count it up yourself, figure out what the lead is. Ultimately, though, at the end of the day, white has a full extra bishop, which is 3 extra points in this position. You can see that white has 3 minor pieces versus black's 2. The rooks are equal, the queens are equal, but ultimately white has an extra bishop in this position for the most part. So white has a 3-point material advantage here. Now, many people think, well, actually, sorry, the next question is that how do we go about converting this material advantage into a win? Sometimes people might think they need to attack using their extra piece, and sometimes that can be a good thing to do. But again, we want to follow the rule generally of trading off equal value of pieces. So how can we do that in this position? How can we go ahead and trade off pieces equally and simplify to a easier position? Well, white could go ahead and do something like bishop takes e7 check. The king goes ahead and takes. Notice how also the queen can't take because the queen is needed to guard the c8 rook. So the king goes ahead and takes instead. So that's been 1 trade of pieces, 1 bishop each. Take a rook. He takes back. We trade off the second pair of rooks. We also take the remaining minor piece. Bishop is 3 points, knight is 3 points. And then at the end of the day, if we could trade the queens, that would be great as well. But ultimately, white is left with a still continuous 3-point advantage. And now that black has less pieces on the board, it's more and more difficult for black to make any kind of counterplay. It's harder for white to make a mistake and somehow misplay the position despite being ahead 3 points. Now white could maybe make a move like queen c3, grab the open file, maybe make a move like knight a5 to start harassing some of the queenside pawns. Of course, he wants to get his king involved at some point. But for the most part, because black has less pieces on the board, it's going to be easier for white to prove his advantage, and that will help him to get a win easier for the most part. Now, what if we happen to be playing and we're the side that is behind in material? How do we play in those kind of positions? Maybe, for example, we made a mistake earlier in the game, we lost material, or maybe we sacrificed the material on purpose earlier on. How should we play, though, when we're at a material disadvantage? Well, you definitely need to play differently than if you were ahead in material. There's no question about that. When you are behind in material, you essentially want to do the opposite of what you do when you're ahead. You generally want to avoid trading pieces, you want to keep pieces on the board, and you want to focus on creating as many complications as possible so that your opponent doesn't have an easy time simplifying the position. Now, this can be easier said than done, though, but if you keep in mind some of the information we talked about during the previous video about using the initiative imbalance, then you'll have a better time creating these complications and posing some problems for your opponent to solve. Let's look at our final position for this video to see how we can play despite having a material deficit. Okay, so in this position here, it is black to move right now, and black is down ultimately 1 point, or 1 pawn in this position. Black has 6 pawns, white has 7, rooks are equal, bishops are equal, but black is down 1 point or 1 pawn in this position. Black is also having a rough time aside from the extra pawn that white has. White's rook is locked very nicely into the d6 square, very active square. Black doesn't really want to trade it because that's going to create a pass pawn, a protected pass pawn for white. So, ultimately, black, though, does have a few different ways of complicating the position. He wants to be able to create counterplay and give white some problems to solve. In the game, black ended up starting off with playing the move pawn takes h5. White went ahead and took the pawn back, and then black made the move rook to g8. Notice how he's creating threats and setting problems for his opponent. Now, white made the move rook d2 in the game, simply defending the pawn, and black made the move rook to g3, moving the rook farther up the board and creating another threat in the position. Now, it's not that easy to guard the pawn right now, so white made the move a4 in order to keep it protected, and then black next swung his other rook over to the g-file, doubling up his rooks against the g-pawn, and white now does not have a good way to defend this pawn again. Of course, if he plays bishop f3, we're going to go ahead and most likely just take the bishop with the pin, and that's going to be leading to a position where white is losing a full piece instead of just a pawn. So at the end of the day, white is going to lose this pawn on g2. Black is going to have some very active rooks that are going to be jumping all around white's position. In the game, white went ahead and played b5, trying to look for counterplay on the queen side. Black took the pawn, white took, black took back, the king went to f1, and ultimately the position is pretty balanced. I would actually venture to say that black might even have an advantage here, especially if he can get to a position where maybe he can kind of harass these pawns from behind, maybe attacking the c-pawn or something like that. Now, again, though, the important thing here is that black was looking for counterplay, especially at the start here. He looked at his advantages he had in the position. He had a good placed bishop on the d5 square. He looked at the ability to open up the g-file, and he looked for the positives in his position rather than focusing on the negatives, the negative of being down a pawn. So there's actually a lot of psychology that you have to take into account when you're the side that's behind in material. You want to make sure that you stay positive, that you have a good mental attitude. You don't want to get down on yourself and get discouraged that you're down material. Instead, you want to look for ways to counter your opponent. You want to look for activity. You want to look for ways to create threats. And hopefully that will set your opponent enough problems that you might be able to win the material back or get some other kind of advantage in the position. So throughout this video, we've learned more about what the material imbalance actually means and how to play effectively whether we're ahead or behind in material. If we're ahead in material, we want to work on trading pieces off and continue to play with a plan and a way to improve our position. If we're behind in material, then we want to play differently. We want to work to keep the pieces on the board for the most part. We want to look to create complications at the same time, create threats, forcing moves, combining some of the stuff we talked about in the initiative video as well. So now that you've seen this video, you should be better equipped to play better, whether you're ahead or behind in material in your own games. The next video in this playlist is going to go more in depth on the pawn structure imbalance, which is the next imbalance we're going to cover, and how to play around the pawn structure during a game that you might have. So are you ready to test yourself to see if you've mastered this material on the material imbalance in chess? Find out now by taking our free quiz on chessuniversity.com. Click the button to the right of the chessboard or the link in the description below the video to take the quiz. Also, if you found the video useful, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel and check out our other content and programs on chessuniversity.com as well. Thanks for watching. Again, this was FIDE Master Dalton Perrine, and I hope everybody has a good rest of the day.